Everybody ready? Okay. I feel extraordinarily privileged to have the opportunity to introduce Naomi Klein today. She's, as you know, is an award-winning journalist and the author of two of the most influential books of our time, No Logo, Taking on the Brand Bullies, and The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. She writes a regular column for The Nation and The Guardian that is syndicated internationally by the New York Times, and is also a contributing editor to Harper's, a reporter for Rolling Stone, and her reporting from occupied Iraq for Harper's earned her the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism. With time short, a single positive comment about each of her books will have to suffice. Time magazine named No Logo one of the top 100 nonfiction books published since 1923. John Gray wrote for The Guardian, "There are very few books that really help us understand the present. The Shock Doctrine is one of those books." I've read it, and Dr. Gray is right about that. When the subject of Naomi Klein and her work comes up, the one thing you'll never hear is, I don't know. Maybe not. People form very strong opinions, and the great majority of readers have found her work to be courageous and persuasive. The dog-eared copies of her two books, now scattered across the globe in the millions in almost 30 languages, attest to that. But Ms. Klein also has all the right critics, including folks at places like the Cato Institute, Americans for Prosperity, founded by Kansas's own Koch brothers, and conservative. You have to include them. Any talk in Kansas, you have to include them. And the conservative National Post in Canada, which really has it in for her. With Naomi's permission and with a heavy heart, I've come up with a few of those negative comments, with a very few, and it pains me to read them. But to come up with these counter-arguments, these critics have had to exercise their imaginative powers to an extraordinary degree. Jonathan Chait described Ms. Klein in the New Republic as displaying, quote, the pseudo-clarity of a conspiracy theorist. Why? Because he cannot believe anyone would dare to suggest that the interest of big business had something to do with the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. That was it. The Shock Doctrine demonstrates how the theories of Milton Friedman and other radical free market economists have helped ruin people's lives worldwide, in countries worldwide. Reacting to that, scholars at the Cato Institute and Americans for Prosperity argued that Klein's analysis is hopelessly flawed. Friedman's own words reveal him to be an advocate of peace, democracy, and individual rights. And that this book would disgust anyone who had the good fortune to meet Friedman and experience him personally. But I'm certain that all of those of you who have not been personal friends of Milton Friedman or, say, Paul Wolfowitz will find the words that you're about to hear utterly compelling. And please welcome Naomi Klein.
Thank you, Stan, for that most memorable introduction. You know, Stan asked me yesterday if I had any favorite insults that had been leveled at me, and that's always a disconcerting question to get from the person who's going to be introducing you. What was more disconcerting was that he seemed so intimately familiar with all of them. More than I was, actually. I learned some stuff there. Thank you, Stan, for that and for your wonderful, wonderful writing and work here. I want to thank the entire team at the Land Institute, most especially Wes Jackson. it is a very precious thing, especially for a writer, but not only for writers, to have a whole new way of looking at the world, as well as a rich store of metaphor and inspiration. And that's pretty much what happens every time you listen to Wes Jackson. And I think that's probably why so many of you here are perennials. That's certainly why I come back. I was here at Prairie Fest last year, not as a speaker, but as a listener, and I came through a rather circuitous route, I guess. I'd been spending a lot of time in Louisiana, writing about, thinking about, meeting with people about the BP disaster, which was very fresh in our minds when we gathered last year. And, as Stan said, I'm not a stranger to disasters. I mean, you could say I'm a disaster junkie. To write the Shock Doctrine, I have to be honest with you, I disaster hopped from one hot spot to the next to build this thesis and do this research about how shocks and crises are systematically used to push through this radical right-wing agenda, whether it was Iraq in the midst of the occupation or Sri Lanka after the tsunami in 2004, or New Orleans in the midst of Hurricane Katrina and afterwards. So, I'm not a stranger to disasters. It's part of my work to be in the midst of them. But nothing has shaken me like the BP disaster for some reason. There was something about the physicality of it, and also the fact that there was video. It was bizarre. There was a 24-hour spill cam that allowed the whole world to watch what I called a hole in the world. It wasn't a spill, right? It was a wound, and people understood it as a wound. I was so struck when I would talk to friends about it. They would clutch their stomachs and say, I can't look at it, I can't look at it. People felt it as a physical wound. And going to the Gulf Coast and talking with people there, obviously the feeling was much stronger, and people would get very angry if you referred to it as a spill. They would use words like hemorrhage. It's not spilling oil, the earth is hemorrhaging. And the more I researched it and researched the process that led up to it, I was so just amazed and distraught by the recklessness that had led up to this decision, the recklessness, the series of decisions at the corporate level, at the government level, that led to this decision to drill at this depth. You read the environmental assessment reports, and I'm sure you remember those crazy stories where it turned out that BP had talked about the impacts, possible impacts of a spill on walruses in the Gulf Coast, right? Because they had just cut and paste from their Alaska or wherever in their Arctic drilling, and they were just so casual. They were just so casual with the precious. And I was even more struck by this when I went out on a research vessel with a group from the University of South Florida, mostly young graduate students, out with their professors, documenting the impact of the spill. And what's so striking about this process is that we really don't understand the deep ocean. I mean, it is mysterious to us. 5% of the deep ocean has been explored. Every time you go down to these depths, they discover new species, right? So there was this terrible convergence of discovery and destruction going on, where you meet these young researchers, these young scientists, who, rather than having that sense of discovery, are actually cataloging the deaths that we don't even understand, that we're discovering for the first time. So this sort of slayed me, this experience with the BP disaster. And my friend Robert Jensen, who's here, when a wonderful writer, told me that what I needed to do was read a book called The Virtues of Ignorance. And those of you who haven't read it should read this extraordinary anthology, because it really speaks to this recklessness, this hubris, like little else. So I spent that summer after the spill reading and rereading these essays and thinking about ignorance, and then decided with Bob that we would go to Prairie Fest. And it was kind of a pilgrimage to meet Wes and Wendell. And I was lucky enough to sit down with them, and we had a very far-ranging, interesting discussion about the willingness to take these risks and the responsibility not to break what we don't know how to fix. And as Wendell says, that the issue of risk raises the issue of scale. We have a responsibility not to take risks on a scale that we can't reverse. And I think this is particularly important in the era of climate change, and we've heard this as a theme running through all the presentations this morning. The way we are responding to climate change, and I'm going to be talking about climate change denial a little bit later on, but here I'm talking about the people who claim not to be denying climate change, but that take it very seriously, respect the science, but yet still imagine that we can respond to this crisis and remain in complete control. And if you go to the UN climate summits and read the serious literature about climate change, running all the way through it is this idea that we are still the ones in charge. And we can do a risk management assessment and decide that, we can live with 2 degrees of warming. That's okay. So we'll let it warm up to 2, but we're going to try to hold it there. Or maybe, maybe we can even live with 4. That's when the costs really start biting at a 4-degree temperature increase. So we'll sort of turn the dial up, and then we'll stop it, and then we'll start to get serious about climate change. And the assumption is, right, that my friend Joni Seeger, a wonderful geographer, describes it as this assumption that the Earth is like an oven and you can just turn the temperature up, and that we won't be overwhelmed by tipping points. So, the assumption that we are in control just pervades this. And so it makes a certain amount of sense if we're acting as if the climate has a thermostat, that we would get really literal about this. And that's what's starting to happen now with the so-called Plan B in response to climate change. Now that it's clear that we don't seem to be cutting our emissions, there's more and more talk about so-called geoengineering solutions, these techno-fix solutions, so-called solutions like putting sulfur into the stratosphere to just reflect more of the sun's rays back to space. It's called solar radiation management, is the technical term, managing the sun. And as part of the research for the book that I'm writing now, I've been hanging around with geoengineers, and it's pretty scary stuff, I'll tell you. So it was good to meet with Wes and Wendell, and I went directly from that conversation to the Kansas City airport, talk about denial. And I was writing in my notebook and writing all these fresh observations, and I looked up, and I found myself looking at a billboard for a new cell phone from Motorola, a new sturdy kind of cell phone. And the slogan, there was a sturdy-looking guy who seemed to be working in some extractive industry, because in one of the ads he was down a hole. So I don't know what kind of hole it was, but he was digging holes, which is a very manly thing to do. And the slogan was, "Slap Mother Nature in the face." So coming straight from Prairie Fest, I have to tell you, Wes, this was quite the slap in the face. It was quite the wake-up. I haven't seen that ad, by the way, anywhere else. I think it's target marketed to Kansas. I'm not sure. But it struck me as enormously symbolic of the narrative that we need to change. This idea that it is our job to slap nature, who of course is a woman, around until she obeys our command. And this is part of a kind of a Madonna whore narrative that we have about Mother Nature, who either needs to be slapped around and put in constraints, a la Francis Bacon, or else when something goes wrong, suddenly Mother Nature reemerges in the discourse as this infinitely resilient, fertile goddess who can take all the abuse that we throw her way. And I'm always struck that, in the midst of disasters like oil spills, suddenly everybody's talking about Mother Nature. Mother Nature can handle it. Mother Nature has a way. Rush Limbaugh said, Mother Nature has a way of cleaning these things up. Don't worry, Mother Nature will clean up, just like your own mother. And But this was one of the first statements that really caught my attention around the BP disaster was Tony Hayward, the former CEO of BP, who said that the amount of oil was relatively small compared to the size of the ocean. Right? So don't worry, she can take it. And we have this same sort of weird dualism in the way we imagine our relationship to nature when it comes to climate change, where, on the one hand, we cast ourselves as masters of the universe, as being completely in charge. But then when it comes to the effects of our actions, we suddenly claim that we have no effect whatsoever. That's ridiculous to claim that our emissions would actually impact. This is natural. It's sunspots. Don't be silly. Right? This is more and more what the discourse of climate change denialism is. It's not denying that things are getting warmer, because that's getting harder to deny. It's denying that little old us, could have any impact whatsoever. So we can't seem to decide, right, whether we are gods or fleas, and we are something in between, flawed as that is. So these are sort of rambly notes from a work in progress, which I don't usually speak until I'm finished a project, and I do that work of cutting down 150,000 words to 4,000 words. So these are more just notes along the road, because I'm really not finished, and who knows, what I'm talking about today could completely change, because that's the great thing about research, is that it changes you. But right now, the project that I'm working on, I'm calling The Message, what climate change is telling us about how we need to evolve. And the talk for today called the revolutionary / evolutionary potential of climate change. And the best way I can describe it is that it's really about how this meta disaster can maybe help us change our story. How we can maybe use climate change, learn from climate change, to get out of this dominance-based, slap Mother Nature in the face worldview, this power over nature, over people, hierarchical worldview. And I think that because climate change tells us in such dramatic fashion that we are not the ones who get the last slap, as it were. The other reason why I think this framing is important is that a lot of people, I think, have turned away from the discussion of climate change because it is all doom and gloom. It's all sort of apocalyptic. And either we're hearing from the James Inhofes of the world that if we take action on climate, it's going to just destroy the economy and destroy jobs and leave that kind of Armageddon in its wake, or it is using really apocalyptic language within the environmental movement, trying to sort of scare people into action. And that tactic generally doesn't work. When people get scared, they kind of want to hide. So I don't think we should use this argument if it isn't true, but let's see whether there are some true things that we can work with here. Because the deeper I get into the real solutions to climate change, not the sort of free market solutions to climate change, but the deeper solutions to climate change, the more it seems to me that these are things that we want to do anyway. And more than that, it seems to me that these are the things that many people in this room have wanted to do anyway. I mean, the deep transformations in agriculture that so many of you have been a part of for decades, you didn't get into it because of climate change. That wasn't what motivated you. But at a certain point, you realized that what you were working towards, because you believe that this is the proper relationship with the land, because of the decimation of the family farms, of rural agriculture, of rural communities, you also understood that this was also a very good way to sequester carbon, and that this was also a solution to climate change. And I can point to many examples of that, where this sort of light bulb turns on, where people realize, okay, this thing that we've been fighting for on its own merits is also the way that we fight climate change. So how can we work with this? And, I was so struck by Brian's wonderful talk this morning, that he didn't mention climate change for, I think, probably the first 35 minutes of the talk. And probably most people here, if not all the people here, were thinking, these are great ideas on their own merits. We want to do this. But then when you add climate change to it, it puts us on a timetable, as my friend Bill McKibben says. It says we can't afford not to do this. This is not just a matter of preference. So it kicks our butt, in other words, to do a whole bunch of things that we would want to do anyway. So I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, too. And this comes to something else that Brian said about how do you pay for it. And how do you pay for it is a really tricky question. And I think the deeper we get into this, and of course, Richard Heinberg's talk tomorrow is going to get a lot deeper into this. The deeper we get into the ecological crisis, and I think climate change really should be understood as, as a message that is pointing us to the broader ecological crisis. It is not the full extent of it, and we have to be careful about the way climate can usurp all other ecological issues. But the deeper we get into it, the more we realize that we really are talking about a fundamental economic transformation. If we are to be able to have the resources to pay for all the things that we want to do. So we aren't just talking about policy preferences. We are talking about an economic transformation. Now, I think that that's good news, because the economic model that we currently have is failing us and the vast majority of people in the world on multiple levels. And there are a lot of people out there who are really interested in a discussion of how to change our economic model. Maybe not because they're interested in the climate crisis at all, but because they're interested in the fact that they're being foreclosed on because they've lost their job, or because they're losing their land, or all those other reasons we have to question our current economic model. So I think we have a moment here. And what worries me now is the compartmentalization that we have around the people who are focused on the economic crisis and the people who are focused on the ecological crisis. There's some communication, but there is not nearly enough. It's slotted into different categories. A lot of this has to do with the impacts of the NGOization of politics. We don't have mass movements anymore. We have campaigns, we have NGOs, and everybody goes off into their corners. But we need a merger, because actually these are the same crisis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so right now we've got the people who are focused on the crisis on Wall Street, the attacks on unions, like the people who mobilized so tremendously in Madison, Wisconsin, people who are focused on attacks on the public sector, and then in the other corner, you have those who are focused on climate change, focused on the broader ecological crisis. So on the one hand, you've got people being treated like garbage, and then on the other hand, you've got the planet being treated as garbage. And we are not making the connections between the underlying logic that treats both people as disposable and our natural systems as disposable. It is the same force that trashes them all. And it seems so popular to mention the Koch brothers around here. They understand it's a single project. They have a coherent project. It's the same project funding the climate change denialists as is attacking the public sector and attacking unions in Wisconsin. It's a coherent project. But while they are organized, we are splintered, and that is a huge problem. Now, if we don't get our act together and build the kind of mass movement that could really push back against these very powerful forces, because I get frustrated sometimes when we put forward these wonderful ideas, but we don't talk about the forces that we're up against, right? We are up against some very, very powerful interests that have a lot to gain by blocking us. And there's no point in talking about what our alternatives are unless we're also talking about what our strategy is for dealing with the very powerful interests that want to block us. So here's why I'm so concerned about this. If we don't develop this strategy, as climate change really starts to bite, we're going to see a very different kind of response. And having been so immersed in disasters in the process of writing the Shock Doctrine, I really feel like I have a pretty keen understanding of how this is going to play out if we're not careful, if we don't stop it. Okay. So the capsule thesis of the Shock Doctrine, assuming lots of you don't know the book, is that we've been lied to about how this fundamentalist version of capitalism has triumphed throughout the world. We're told that we ended up with this sort of fundamentalist version of capitalism based on deregulation, cuts to the public sector, privatization, unfettered free trade, because everybody wanted it so badly that it spread throughout the world on the wings of democracy. This is the fairy tale version of history that is written by the think tanks, essentially, which is why they don't like the book that much. What I argue in the Shock Doctrine is that this ideology has ridden on the backs of disasters, has ridden on the backs of shocks. So that's not to say that it doesn't sometimes come through democratically, that people don't vote for a Reagan or a Thatcher. Of course they do. But in every one of these cases where you have a big leap forward for this ideology, it is on the back of a large-scale crisis. Whether it is an economic crisis. I start the book in the military dictatorships in the 1970s in Latin America that formed the laboratories for this ideology. The first country in the world to put Milton Friedman's ideas in practice was Chile under Augusto Pinochet. So that wasn't a disaster. That was just using brute force to overthrow a democratically elected socialist government and put in place this fundamentalist a version of capitalism through the use of brute force and torture. So that's how this experiment started. As it moved on, they got better at it, and they learned that it's really, really handy when you have an economic crisis and people are really scared, especially when you have things like hyperinflation. And then you can say, whatever you voted for doesn't actually matter because we don't have a choice now. We've got a crisis, and that means we have to centralize power in the hands of experts. And those experts, know what's best for you, and they're going to give you your bitter medicine, and it's often called shock therapy for the economy. Now we see this playing out right now around the world. We see it in Greece, we see it in Spain. This is why people are in the streets, because they are getting policies that have absolutely nothing to do with what they voted for, or the exact opposite of what they voted for, and they're being told, you can't have that, you have to accept these deep austerity cuts in the name of so-called shared sacrifice, and so on, right? So it started under dictatorship, it evolved through economic crisis, and then I argue that wars and natural disasters became the enabler as these policies became more unpopular. And I end the book in New Orleans with a chapter of what I call disaster apartheid, because when we think about what New Orleans went through during Hurricane Katrina, survival was really about who had resources. I mean, if you had a car and you could drive out of the city, if you were at the mercy of the state and you were depending on the state for your evacuation, you were left there. And then the government seemingly couldn't find you for days on end. And I show in the book how New Orleans became a kind of a laboratory for this ideology. And it was very overt. It's one of the most classic examples of what I'm calling the Shock Doctrine. 10 days after Katrina hit, there was a meeting at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, and the minutes from this meeting were leaked to the Wall Street Journal, and I have them up on my website. The headline is 36 Free Market Solutions for Hurricane Katrina, and it's just a laundry list of everything that they want to do in this moment of dislocation that was caused by a hurricane. By the time it hit New Orleans, it was not a Category 5 hurricane. It shouldn't have flooded the city. It flooded the city because of weak infrastructure. It was a collision between heavy weather, may or may not be linked to climate change, and weak infrastructure, the inability, the systematic neglect of the public sphere that made them unable to deal with that. That's the deadly combination. And so the Heritage Foundation hosted this meeting. They brought together a whole bunch of other think tanks as well as Republican politicians from Congress, and they came up with their wish list. And what's on the wish list? Well, privatize the public education system, give parents vouchers so that they don't have to send their kids to public school, tear down the public housing projects, even though many of them were not even touched by the floodwaters, just take advantage of the crisis. I quote Richard Baker in my book, we couldn't get rid of those housing projects, but God did. They closed down Charity Hospital. If you go to New Orleans today, you can put a check mark next to almost every one of these proposals. The other thing they talked about was how they wanted to open up Anwar to drilling and build more refining capacity. So this is interesting. So their solution to a crisis that was created by a collision of heavy weather that may or may not have been linked to climate change and weak infrastructure was to get rid of the remaining public infrastructure and drill for more fossil fuels and more refining capacity, which is the root cause of climate change. So they had absolutely no intention of getting at what was causing the crisis, because there's no problem if people actually want to respond to crisis with decisive action that actually solves the crisis. The problem is responding to disaster in a totally opportunistic way, in ways that actually deepen those causes of the crisis, and that's what I'm talking about. So I see New Orleans, and then the other thing that we saw was an extraordinarily privatized disaster response. I mean, I was there with my friend Jeremy Scahill at The Nation, and I don't know if you guys know Jeremy's work. He wrote a book called Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and that book began that week when we were down in New Orleans together because he discovered that Blackwater was there. That Blackwater had filled the gap left by a failed state. And this is what happens. You neglect the public sphere, and the private sector will come in, they will provide the same services for a profit. And it's gotten a lot worse since I published the book. I mean, I published the book a few months later. We found out about that privatized firefighting was back in the United States. It was AIG who introduced that, and then they got nationalized, so I don't know what you call that. But they were offering for-profit firefighting to their premium payers. So this is what we have to look forward to if we continue down this road in a more turbulent future. We're going to see the disaster of climate change itself being used for this kind of shock doctrine tactic, and that's what we need to avoid. Now, I am actually not despairing in the face of this, and I feel that that this could go in a very, very different way. Now, if I tell you where I'm getting my hope from, you're going to find this very odd, but where I'm getting my hope from is from the climate change deniers. And I've been hanging out with them. This is part of the wonderful process of book writing and not being nearly as famous as Stan made me out to be, is that I actually can go completely undercover to the premier climate change denial conference that's held every year in Washington, hosted by the Heartland Institute, which is a free market think tank. And I just went with my husband, Avi Lewis, who's making a documentary, and so we had a film crew, and we interviewed all the leading deniers. We were really hoping to interview James Inhofe, who was scheduled to be the opening keynote speaker. And over breakfast, they announced that James Inhofe was sick, and he was not going to be able to make it, and people were obviously very upset because he's a huge hero to this crowd. It turns out, we found this out the next day, that James Inhofe was sick. He was sick because he'd gone swimming in a lake in Oklahoma filled with blue-green algae. And but what's so remarkable, if you really want to know the powers of denial, is that from his sickbed, he wrote a letter to the climate change denial conference about how sad he was that he couldn't be with them, and just a sort of a pep talk telling them that they needed to keep fighting harder, even though they'd had all kinds of victories, that they still had to keep going. So even though he was arguably suffering from a climate change-related illness, this is what happened. All right, so why would I be hopeful about this kind of stuff? Because I'm weird? No. I have been listening to climate change deniers very closely. I've been reading their books with titles like Watermelon. Get it? Green on the outside, red on the inside. or climate coup. What the thesis of all these books is that climate change is a conspiracy that has been dreamed up by the vast left-wing international agenda to replace capitalism with eco-socialism. And it's not, but it could be. Now, here's the thing. This is what I believe. I believe that the right, the far right, understands climate change better than the left. I believe that they understand how deeply this science challenges our current economic model, and that the real denialists are the environmentalists telling us to change our light bulbs. They understand how deeply this challenges everything that they stand for. Their entire agenda of telling us that all we are is our greed, that all we are markets, that nothing else matters, cannot survive if the science is true. If the science is true, it's game over for them. Now, that doesn't mean that we're bringing back state socialism as they claim. You know, they're using all of this alarmist agenda. Now, let me just be really, really clear, because they're tape recorders. They are not right about the science. They are wrong about the science, okay? The science is real. What they're right about are the consequences of the science. And that is why they're denying climate change, because they understand the consequences of the science. So, who are the real denialists? Now, let's think about some of the things that we would have to do if we were actually going to listen to what scientists like James Hansen are telling us, which is that we need something like, at 80% emission cuts in the next few decades. What would that actually look like? What would we have to do? So the rhetoric they're using is, okay, be a return to state socialism, and we've all been waiting for this moment. We've been waiting for our crisis to bring this back. So let's be really clear about something else. The only thing that is as bad for the planet as capitalist fundamentalism is state socialism. Okay, the only time that emissions have gone down significantly was when the Soviet Union collapsed in the mid-90s. That's the only time where you see a significant blip in greenhouse gas emissions. The carbon footprint for people living in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia under communism was higher than the carbon footprint per capita in the United States and in Canada. So, what I think is really scary is China's hybrid, which combines the most powerful political tools of authoritarian communism, central planning, merciless repression, constant surveillance, harnessed to advance the goals of global capitalism, which some are calling market Stalinism. Now, that is a really scary formula. So they're wrong about the idea that this is an agenda to bring back state socialism. But they're absolutely right that it has to bring back a word that they're really, really scared of, and a word that we've heard a lot of already today. That word is planning, right? Let's not forget that within this worldview, the worldview that governs our society, planning is a dirty word. You are allowed to do it, interestingly, at a city council, but you're not allowed to have plans at the federal level. And that's what's so interesting about Wes and Wendell's 50-year farm bill. Think this idea of a 50-year farm bill, that is heresy to this crowd, to think that far in the future, to plan. But of course, we would have to plan. We would have to plan at every level, internationally, nationally, locally. Every community has to have what the Transition Town movement calls an energy descent plan. So we would have to recover this lost art of planning. It would have to be decentralized, democratic, nothing like the state socialist boogeyman that they are holding up. And yet it is a profound challenge to laissez-faire capitalism. Let's be honest about this. It also challenges another one of the key tenets of this corporatist project that we've all been living through since Reagan, which is the idea that the public sphere should be completely privatized, or there has been a war on the public sphere. But if you are serious about responding to climate change, you need the public sphere. I mean, everybody loses their free market religion in a disaster, right? I always remember that Jonah Goldberg, very right-wing columnist, sort of lost it during Hurricane Katrina, and he said, "Where's the big government when you need it? We want big government to saddle up," right? But big government couldn't find New Orleans because it had been so thoroughly hollowed out and privatized and outsourced. So in a disaster, you need the public sector. And you also need the public sector to make the kinds of large-scale investments that go beyond changing the light bulb, right? So we need an investment in the public sphere to make us more resilient in the face of disaster, and we need to transform that public sphere. It's not just a reconstruction project; it's a reimagination project, as Kamir described so well earlier. But the idea that the public sphere is our enemy is, it's a ridiculous idea in the context of climate change. And we also need these public investments to mitigate climate change, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, like public transit systems and so on. So we've got planning, we've got the return of the public sphere. And then there's free trade, right? I mean, this is one of the things that frustrates me as somebody who is more focused on economics than on ecology, is, I listen to people talking about the importance of localizing food systems and localizing manufacturing as if the fight against free trade never happened. What was the essence of why many of us opposed agreements like NAFTA or protested in Seattle against the World Trade Organization? The essence of it was that we were losing our democratic ability to have economic self-determination, and that locked into the agreements that our governments were signing was the idea that we could no longer prefer, it's called national preference, we couldn't favor a local business or a national business, that multinational corporations had the right to equal treatment, right? These free trade agreements are Bill of Rights for corporations to have absolute freedom around the world, and it made it illegal for us to protect our communities, to invest locally. It was vilified as protectionism. So it's obvious that we need to localize our economies in the context of climate change. We've heard it from almost every speaker, so I'm not going to get into it now. But all I'm pointing out is that anybody who thinks this doesn't challenge the fundamental capitalist project that we've been living through, of which free trade has been the absolute centerpiece, is deluding themselves. So what else do we have to do in the context of climate change? Well, we need to regulate the hell out of corporations, right? That's another thing they're not so crazy about. We need to get in the way of fossil fuel extraction. We need to say something like the tar sands in my country, in Canada, is an abomination, and you have to leave it in the ground. You don't want to have these battles. I mean, that's what's at stake in the battle over Keystone. And I know this is a battle that many of you are engaged in, and at the local level it often plays out about, this particular pipeline. And they try to attack you and say, you're not really against the pipeline, you're against the tar sands. Be proud of that if it's true. Be very proud of that. Because it's ridiculous to just be against the pipeline. The issue is that the pipeline doubles the capacity of the tar sands. The tar sands is a black hole in the center of my country. We are flaying the earth alive. Every barrel of oil taken out of the tar sands has 3 times the greenhouse gas emissions than a barrel of conventional oil, and we're powering it through fracking. We have the largest frack in the history of the world in British Columbia, and that natural gas is feeding the oil extraction. It's a kind of a bizarre cannibalism going on. So as James Hansen says, it's game over if we extract that oil in the Canadian tar sands. We've gotten 3% of it so far. They want to get all of it. It's an area the size of England. So we need to be saying no. Really simple messages, right? Climate change policy has gotten really confusing. People don't understand what cap and trade is. They understand what keep the oil in the ground is. And I think that tar sands, we have, as Bill McKibben says, we have a shared responsibility to keep that oil in the ground in the same way that we ask Brazil to protect their rainforests. It is a responsibility to the planet and to all of humanity. So we need to have that kind of regulation, that kind of old-fashioned regulation, the kind of regulation that says no. And we also obviously need to have caps on carbon use. And this kind of stuff is kryptonite to people at the Cato Institute, at the American Enterprise Institute. It goes against their entire ideological project. So now, where is this leading us? I mean, is this just leading us to a kind of a green Keynesianism? I've heard this phrase used, right? So we'll have a better public, we'll have a stronger public sector. We'll go back to the pre-free trade era. We will manage our trade again. And the problem is we can't go back to green Keynesianism doesn't exist. And Richard Heinberg is going to do a great job explaining to us tomorrow why we are at the limits of growth. And that's when you start understanding how fundamental this challenge is. Because capitalism can't survive without growth. Capitalism is a system that needs growth in order to survive. It is its oxygen. So I understand that people feel iffy about talking about capitalism, but to me, it's a bit of an absurdity to talk about growth and not talk about capitalism. Because you can't, the idea that you could have a capitalism without growth, I think is really skirting the issue. So then, if we're not going to have growth, where are we going to get the money for this, right? Because the thing about growth is that it defers the question of social justice, right? I mean, this is why politicians, one of the reasons why politicians like to be able to always say, we'll grow our way out of it, is that you never have to take away, right? It's just we're going to grow the pie, and everybody is going to get a piece this time, and we'll bring the whole developing world up too. So we avoid all of the hard discussions about redistribution. But if you accept, actually, that we're hitting the ecological wall and that we can't have a growth-based economic model, then we have to start asking, how are we going to fund the transformation that we're describing? How are we going to fund it? And we're going to fund it by going where the money is, right? And this is really why they're scared, because we're necessarily talking about redistribution of wealth. And that is the biggest rule breaker of them all. So we're talking about taxing carbon, we're talking about taxing financial speculation, talking about taxing corporations and the super rich, going after military budgets, obviously going after the absurd subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And much of this will only work if it's implemented by governments coordinating their responses with each other. So corporations can't avoid carbon taxes in one country by going to another country. And this is why you often hear in the denialist crowd that climate change is a conspiracy to bring in world government. It's not a conspiracy to bring in world government, but you do need a serious international regulatory system for this to work. And that scares them. So, how do we do this? Even if all these revenue streams came online, the bill for climate change would still be too high. It's not just the renewable energy subsidies and infrastructure investments that we need. Every disaster that we face, we just heard about a $3 billion disaster. We seem not to be able to have a disaster that doesn't cost at least $1 billion now, right? And these costs are being passed on to taxpayers. And now we have the Republican Party explicitly saying that they want to offset the costs of Hurricane Irene with spending cuts, right? So then you get into a really vicious cycle where we're doing spending cuts to offset disasters, and where is that going to play out? That's going to play out at the local level. It's going to play out on the infrastructure that we need to deal with those disasters. And then the response will be privatized disaster. So, not to get too conspiratorial, but you already heard they call me a conspiracy theorist, so it's not a huge surprise. I think the only rational way forward is to fully embrace the principle already established in Western law, which is that the polluter pays. Oil and gas companies are the most profitable corporations in the history of money, as Bill McKibben says. The top 5 oil companies made $900 billion in profits in the last decade. I mean, that just blows me away. ExxonMobil cleared $20 billion in profits just in their last quarter. $20 billion. This is the money we need to do the transformation that's required. There isn't another way to get it. So for decades, these companies have been pledging to use their profits to invest in renewable energy, and that was BP's whole Beyond Petroleum thing, where they're moving beyond petroleum, and all of their ads were filled with windmills and solar panels and things like that. We saw where they put their money. They put their money into doubling down and figuring out how to get the oil out of the deepest ocean and how to get it out of the Arctic and how to do horizontal fracking. That is where they're putting their ingenuity and their innovation, left to their own devices. It went into their shareholders' pockets, and it went into that kind of technology. Plenty of it has also, as you know, gone to paying lobbyists to fight every progressive piece of environmental legislation on the books, rolling back the stuff that's already there, and of course, funding the climate change denier movement that I've been speaking about. So it's past time for a much greater share of the global fossil fuel profits to end up in public hands, where it can be used to pay the costs for a post-carbon transition, in much the same way that tobacco companies were forced to pay for programs to get people to quit smoking. That means taxing them, but it also means governments negotiating much higher royalty rates for the extraction currently taking place. I think we also need to talk about even more radical things like public trusts and nationalizations if they stand in the way. Just as BP had to clean up the mess they made in the Gulf of Mexico, so the entire fossil fuel sector must help pay for the costs of avoiding catastrophic climate change. When the people writing books with names like Watermelon talk about how climate change is a plot to redistribute wealth, this is their great fear. They know that there's no other way to respond to a crisis of this magnitude without going after the cash that is concentrated at the tip top of our economic pyramid. And they also know that the mass transit and affordable housing that will be built will benefit low-income people disproportionately. That's the way public investment works, and that also bothers them. They also understand that once the reality of climate change is recognized, wealth will need to be transferred not just within rich countries, or seemingly rich countries, whose emissions created the climate crisis, but also to poorer countries who are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, but did almost nothing to create the crisis. This also is somewhere where the polluter pays principle is at work. And what makes a lot of conservatives most nervous, and actually a lot of liberals, about the UN climate negotiation process is that it has revived a courage in parts of the developing world that many had thought had died for good in the context of structural adjustment and neoliberal triumphalism. Armed with an irrefutable scientific case about who is responsible for global warming and who is suffering its effects most, governments like Ecuador and Bolivia are attempting to shed the mantle of debtor and are saying that they are actually creditors, owed not just money and technology to cope with climate change, but also the atmospheric space to develop, that they have the right to develop. And this is where things get really scary if you happen to be at the Cato Institute. So I don't think they are paranoid. I think they're paying attention to the implications of what this quite revolutionary science is telling us. So let's summarize. Responding to climate change requires that we break every single rule in the free market playbook, that we do so with great urgency, that we need to rebuild our public sphere, reverse privatization, relocalize large parts of our economies, deindustrialize agriculture, scale back overconsumption, bring back long-term planning, heavily regulate and tax corporations, maybe even nationalize some of them, cut military spending, and recognize our debts to the global south. Now, of course, none of this is possible if it's not accompanied by a massive, broad-based effort to radically reduce the influence that corporations have over the political process, which means, at minimum, publicly funded elections and stripping corporations of their status as people under the law. So, this is what gives me hope. Climate change supercharges the pre-existing case for virtually every single progressive demand on the books. It binds them together into a coherent agenda based on a clear scientific imperative. So imagine how this looks for a moment to some of the people who are at the forefront of the climate change denial movement. somebody like Nigel Lawson, who wrote a book in which he proclaims that green is the new red. Nigel Lawson was Margaret Thatcher's finance minister, chancellor of the exchequer, and he prides himself for having sold off the British state and broken the coal miners' union, and he thought he had buried these issues for good. Then along comes climate change, and they're crawling out of the dustbin of history, and they're having to debate the fundamentals of the free market system again, and they're not happy about it. So it looks to them like the end of the world. It's not. It's the end of their world, but it's not the end of the world. It does mean that the ideological edifice on which contemporary conservatism rests, the vilification of all corporate regulation, the war on big government, and all forms of collective action, the veneration of infinite consumer choice, has just been detonated. There is simply no way to square a belief system that vilifies collective action and venerates total market freedom with the problem that demands collective action on an unprecedented scale and a dramatic reining in of the market forces that created and are deepening the crisis. What the climate deniers understand is that as soon as they admit that climate change is real, they will lose the central ideological battle of our time, whether we need to plan and manage our societies to reflect our goals and values, or whether it can simply be left to the magic of the market. So, if I were them, I would be scared too. It's always easier to deny reality than to watch your worldview get shattered. A fact that was as true of diehard Stalinists in the 1950s as it is of the libertarian climate deniers today. That's why James Inhofe can go for a swim in blue-green algae and then write a letter to climate deniers, egging them on. Now, this is reflected in all of the polling data, and I'm sure some of you have seen these really scary polls. 2007, 71% of Americans believed that humans were contributing to climate change. That was 2007. 2009, it was down to 51%. The latest Harris poll has it down to 41%. Here's what's really incredible. That doesn't happen in polling. The pollsters cannot believe that it has gone from 71% to 41% between 2009 and 2011. It is unbelievable. But what's really unbelievable is that it's entirely on one end of the ideological spectrum. People who identify as Democrats and liberals still overwhelmingly believe in climate change, 71 to 75%. Where it has collapsed is on the far right end of the spectrum. It's not just about Republicans. It's about people who identify with what the sociologists call a hierarchical or individualist mindset. So they ask them a series of questions, right? Do you believe that racial discrimination still exists? Things like that. Do you believe the government has any role in fighting poverty? If they say no and no to questions like this, then they get ranked as being a hard hierarch. That means they have a strong dominance-based worldview. They think the poor deserve their plight. They're the kinds of people who scream, "Let them die," in Republican presidential debates. That's what we're talking about. The more invested you are in that worldview, the more certain it is that you will deny the science, because the science so deeply challenges your worldview. It's called cultural cognition. So it's very clear what's happening and why it's happening. All right. How am I doing for time? Over. All right. Here's what I'm worried about. And this is why I think it's important to understand that values are informing it. You know, it isn't about what political party you voted for. It's about your view of the world. It's about your worldview. And if you have this idea that some people's lives are worth more than others, that is shaping how you view climate change. But that's not the scariest part. It's also going to shape the way we respond to climate change once it's no longer possible to deny. That's what really scares me. The Chamber of Commerce, which has been very involved in climate denial, but they also leave open the possibility that global warming could be real. But what they say is that populations can acclimatize to warmer climates via a range of behavioral, psychological, and technological adaptations. These adaptations are what I'm worried about. How are we going to adapt to the people made homeless and jobless by increasingly intense and frequent natural disasters? How will we treat the climate refugees who arrive on our shores in leaky boats? Will we open our borders, recognizing that we played a large part in creating the crisis from which they're fleeing? Or will we build ever more high-tech fortresses and adopt ever more draconian anti-immigration laws? How will we deal with resource scarcity? We know the answer to these questions in our hearts. We know because all we have to do is look at what we do already. In the context of scarcity, the corporate resource scramble will become more rapacious and more violent. Already large tracts of arable land in Africa, in Mali, Ethiopia, Kenya are already being grabbed by foreign corporations to provide food and fuel for wealthier countries. We also know that we'll deal with peak oil and gas by using those ever riskier technologies and turning ever larger swaths of the planet into sacrifice zones. We know that we will fortress our borders and intervene in conflicts in what my colleague at The Nation, Christian Parenti, calls the politics of the armed lifeboat. And as the effects of climate change begin to affect not just the poor but the wealthy as well, we'll increasingly look to those techno fixes like geoengineering. And what a lot of those models show is that their highest risk in the parts of the world that are, for instance, most dependent on monsoons. So, you put sulfur in the upper atmosphere, and suddenly India loses its monsoon season. So if we don't get at the mentality that says let them die at about one person, we're going to start hearing it about millions and millions of people. That's why this is really about values and what we stand for and what we stand up against. I could go on about this. A couple weeks ago, it was announced that Jeb Bush has a new business enterprise. He is launching a for-profit disaster response company, helping corporations and wealthy individuals to deal with disaster. What got my attention is that he's gone into business with an oil and gas services company to launch this company. So it's kind of vertical integration, if you will. We create the disasters, we clean up after them. We've already seen, actually quite recently, we know that the big agribusiness companies are talking about how they have climate-ready seeds, which of course they don't have climate-ready or drought-resistant seeds, but they're now using the climate change as a tool to break through resistance to GMOs, particularly in places like Africa. And this, once again, just has happened in recent weeks, that Kenya, which is in the midst of a massive famine, has just abolished their ban on GMOs, and it's under the guise of responding to disasters. So this is already happening. This is not about conspiracies. This is about just looking at what we're doing already and saying, okay, if we don't stop, this is where this is going to take us. Now, the only wild card is whether some other social force intervenes to provide a viable alternative to this grim future. And this would require more than advocating an alternative set of policies. It requires taking aim at that foundation, at the hierarchical and hyper-individualist ideas that are hostile to democracy, that seek to maintain gross inequalities and to protect unjustly acquired power. It means responding to the collapse of this dominance-based narrative by telling a different kind of story. Because this is why people are in denial, because one worldview is shattered, but there isn't another worldview that has filled it. In fact, something very different has happened because the environmental movement has responded to the fears on the right by trying to say, don't worry about this is going to be great for capitalism. We're going to have green capitalism, green growth, change your light bulbs. It's going to be a boom for venture capitalists. And so there isn't an alternative at all, and we're just reinforcing these same values. We're sending the message that you are just a consumer, and markets are all that matter. So we're actually making the problem worse. I want to just finish up with a quote from a friend of mine named Tim DeChristopher, who, when I talk about it, I start crying, so I'm going to try to be calm. Do people here know Tim? So Tim DeChristopher, for those of you who don't know, is a remarkable young man who decided that he didn't just want to sign petitions and go to marches to express the fact that he is very frightened about what his future looks like for him and his friends. And he was studying environmental science, and he was studying ecological limits. And then he found out in the dying days of the Bush administration, this was after Bush had already, McCain had lost, Obama had won, but it was in that window before Obama had come to power. There was a fire sale of oil and gas leases in Utah, and it was happening under really irregular circumstances. They have since been ruled to have been so irregular that they have been repealed, most of them. And Tim decided he just couldn't let this happen. He didn't really think it through, but he went to the auction, he walked in, he picked up a paddle, and he started bidding. And he bought, I think, $26 million worth of oil and gas leases before they figured out that he didn't have any money. And this was incredible, and he became a hero, and his paddle said bidder number 70, so this whole movement has started, the bidder 70 movement. But what isn't funny at all is that Tim is serving 2 years in prison for standing up for his beliefs in a totally nonviolent way, and standing up against policies that this administration has ruled were actually wrong and irregular, and they have rolled them back, but yet Tim is still in jail. So, because Tim is in jail and shouldn't be, I want to just end on some words of his. He says, "We need to stop being defensive against accusations that our demands will lead to damaging the economy. Mainstream green groups typically respond by talking about growth, green jobs, and the advantages for corporations of the green economy. But I believe we should embrace the charges. No, we are not trying to disrupt the economy, but yes, we do want to turn it upside down. We should not try and hide our vision about what we want to change, of the healthy, just world that we wish to create. We are not looking for small shifts. We want a radical overhaul of our economy and society. I think once we start talking about that, we will find that we have more allies than we expect." I agree. I agree with that. Our experiment in deregulated Wild West economies is failing the vast majority of the people around the world, from family farmers to public sector workers facing yet another round of austerity cuts, to manufacturing workers whose jobs have disappeared to free trade, to young people entering a job market with sky-high unemployment. These systemic failures are precisely why so many people are in open revolt against their elites around the world, whether it's in Madison, whether it's in Athens, whether it's in Cairo, demanding living wages and an end to corruption. Responding to climate change means that we have no choice but to do things very differently, to democratically plan and design our economies based on our collective priorities. We know that societies can turn nasty quickly. We have to believe they can turn kind. Thank you. Thank you so much.